Hello, my name is Sarah Satius, and I'm going to talk to you about prediabetes and gestational diabetes. Prediabetes is a buffer period before the onset of type 2 diabetes. So the blood sugar levels are higher than normal but lower than diagnostic criteria of type 2 diabetes. Symptoms include increased thirst, frequent urination, excess hunger, fatigue, and blurred vision. You're going to notice a pattern between this and gestational diabetes, so a lot of these will be repeated because both of them just have to do with increased sugar concentrations in the blood and insulin not working. If you don't already have a basic knowledge of diabetes basically is when there's increased concentration of sugar in the blood because insulin, the enzyme that allows cells to use sugar and take up sugar from the blood to use them, is not working properly. Whether that be because it's not being produced or because it's basically lower sensitivity, that you have a lower tolerance to it. Um, the history that I've chosen to talk about are three main points that I have found. I have also deemed it important to include that the normal fasting plasma glucose concentration is less than 100. So, 1997, fasting glucose was defined as plasma glucose. And for prediabetes, it should have a concentration of 110 to 125. This whole thing's just important because it means that it's been acknowledged and it's now an actual thing, and you can be diagnosed with prediabetes. 2003, criteria for impaired fasting glucose, which is another way, it's just another result of measuring your blood to see if you have prediabetes, was lowered to 100 to 125. And then in 2011, HbA1c bounds of prediabetes were also lowered again. So basically, the range between normal and having type 2 diabetes has been increased since 1997 up to now. Causes and pathophysiology. So, overall, prediabetes is caused by genetics and by epigenetics. That includes obesity, a larger waist circumference, inactivity, and diets high in simple sugars. Now, lots of cross-sectional and prospective studies have unanimously confirmed that obesity is one of the environmental factors that has a correlation with type 2 diabetes. And recent studies have also shown that larger waist circumferences could be a better indication of developing type 2 diabetes than BMI. Obviously, inactivity is also a cause. Physiologically, this is because during acute contractions of active muscles, when you move basically, there's an immediate uptake of glucose from the blood for energy, obviously. And when someone is physically inactive, those do not happen. Or, I mean, that whole thing doesn't happen, and it doesn't happen often enough. So, a sedentary lifestyle is strongly correlated with weight gain or obesity, which has already been identified to be causes of prediabetes. Diagnoses are made by doing these two main tests that they do. One of them is fasting plasma glucose test, which is when you fast for 8 hours before having your blood drawn, and then those results will determine whether or not you are within the normal range, the pre-diabetic range, and type 2 diabetic range. Oral glucose tolerance test includes taking your blood when immediately and then drinking a thing of sugar water, and then 2 hours later drawing your blood again to see how efficient your body was or your body cells were at uptaking sugar from the blood, because you would either see a decrease or the same amount of expected sugars in the blood from the amount that's in the water, which is specifically for adults, 8 ounces of solution with 75 grams of sugar, and for children, 1.7 grams of sugar per kilogram of body weight. When you're pregnant and you're taking this test, it's 8 ounces of solution with 100 grams of sugar. So the treatments, if you are diagnosed with prediabetes, include lifestyle interventions and medications. However, the plus side is that prediabetes is shown to be very successful in preventing the further prediabetes if taken action. Let me clarify. You can't just live with prediabetes and not do anything. But if you do something and you catch it early before type 2 diabetes, there's been shown successes in preventing the further progression of it. These lifestyle interventions include weight loss, a healthy diet, and increased physical activity, And medications include anti-obesity drugs to help with weight loss or anti-diabetic drugs. I've included an example drug for anti-diabetic drugs. It's called metformin, and this diagram includes or shows you the negative feedback loop that it causes to decrease the amount of sugar in your blood. Epidemiology, the spookiest part of this whole thing, I swear. 4 in 10 Americans have prediabetes. That's 38%. And I consider this a very, very high percentage. Also, prediabetes kills 50% more people than diabetes. It's stated by the World Health Organization, so I do trust it, but I couldn't find an exact answer. So by the previous knowledge that I have and what we've learned in this class, I'm going to assume that it's because diabetes probably has more prominent symptoms by then, and that's once you have by the time you have diabetes, those symptoms are probably so bad that you notice them and you go to the doctor and you get help. Whereas prediabetes, sometimes the symptoms won't be as bad and you won't notice it for a while or before complications arise, basically. Other stats that are women have more obesity-induced prediabetes compared to men. However, the risk of diabetes starts at a lower BMI value for men compared to women. People with parents who have type 2 diabetes have a 40% higher chance of developing the same condition. Absolutely bonkers. And people of color, examples African Americans and Native Americans, are more likely to develop diabetes. Now, if you are a person of color and you have these risks and causes that could also cause prediabetes, then it is recommended to get tested every 2 to 3 years after the age of 25. Do it if you have noticed that you have any of these, because again, 50% more with prediabetes than people with diabetes, people. All right, and finally, the prognosis, if you really weren't going to do anything about it. Now, if your thing is developed in type 2 diabetes and you still didn't do anything, you will get microvascular and macrovascular complications. Now, microvascular complications include retinopathy, nephropathy, and neuropathy. In simpler terms, you're going to have problems with your eyes, kidneys, and nerves. Macrovascular problems include strokes, cardiovascular diseases, and peripheral artery disease, mostly because of the high blood pressure of the increased sugar concentrations in your blood. I've also included this neat diagram to the right that's super spooky that has to do with diabetes and kidney disease, because diabetes is a leading cause of kidney failure, accounting for 4% of new cases in 2008. Also incredibly bonkers, so please read up on that and pause this if you want. I will have to move on to part 2 though, gestational diabetes. It's a condition in which your blood sugar levels become high, specifically during pregnancy. Symptoms also, as seen in prediabetes, will include thirst, hunger, and increased urination. Now, there's lots of history for gestational diabetes just because the start of noticing it and doing anything about it is way earlier than prediabetes. In 1822, it was observed that there were higher deaths of babies in women. Okay, babies and women, and a doctor in London specifically pinpointed this to that it's caused by diabetes, that it's diabetes specifically that has to do with pregnancy, and that it's diabetes that may or may not happen outside of pregnancy. Whether that's after or before. In 1877, sugar was identified in urine of some pregnant women. Ooh, not looking good. And then 1898, it was found that pregnant women were less tolerant to sugar than non-pregnant women. Now, gestational diabetes mellitus was officially an accepted term, and classifications of diabetes and pregnancy were solidified in 1949 and in the 1950s. In 1957, the proposal of the oral glucose tolerance test was performed during, or was the proposal of it being performed during pregnancy was brought up and started. And in 2008, internationally uniform criteria for the diagnosis and classification of diabetes in pregnancy was finalized, which means you have if there is an official way to go about stuff, there's an official diagnosis or way to diagnose an official thing that we are going to test women between certain weeks, then I can say that there's better health care than there was in 1822, obviously. So, lots and lots of causes, risks, people. Overweight, if you're overweight during before pregnancy, if you are older than 25, if you are a person of color, as previously stated, if prediabetes was present before, if a family member has diabetes, if you have had gestational diabetes before in a pregnancy, if you have high blood pressure or other medical complications, or if you've given birth to a large baby before, or have given birth to a baby that was a stillborn or have had certain birth defects. Um, it diagnosis gestational diabetes is usually checked between 24 to 24, 8 weeks of pregnancy. But if you aren't high risk because of if you have anything on this list, you might be tested earlier. And if you test and it's normal and you do have higher risk, you might also be tested later just to make sure it doesn't come up later during the pregnancy. You will use an oral glucose tolerance test, and I thought this was very interesting, which is why I included this diagram. Most women do not experience obvious symptoms, so that's why it was officialized that they would check it between 24 to 28 weeks of pregnancy. Um, Treatments just include eating healthier foods, exercising regularly, monitoring your blood sugar, and getting tested for diabetes after pregnancy. In some more serious cases, women take insulin. Now, this affects up to 10% of women in the US per year. And interestingly enough, about 50% of women with gestational diabetes go on to develop type 2 diabetes. Super scary. Get tested for diabetes after pregnancy is a must. Prognosis, complications, you might have an extra large baby. You're going to have a C-section because you have an extra large baby. You're going to have high blood pressure, or you may have low pressure during the pregnancy, which could affect the baby. And as we said before, increased risk of type 2 diabetes after pregnancy. If you want to pause and read up on more complications to the right in this diagram, please do. And that is it that I have for prediabetes and gestational diabetes. Thank you for listening.